Good morning, everyone. Module 4, Governing Human Behavior Inside AI System. I'm glad that you're back. I'm hoping that you watched Module 1, 2, and 3 before you dive into governing human behavior. Now, if you do have a background in HR, social services, or even social science, psychology, then you'll have a great understanding of human behavior than those that have actually no background or academics. The premises of this module is precise and is consequential. The greatest risk inside any AI governance framework is not just the algorithm or not the data pipeline or the regulatory gap, it is the humans who design it. And I believe if you implement it and operate it, you fully understand the risk factors that are involved even with the decision making behind AI. This morning I was watching a clip from Vancouver's news media, and they have a walkout because they're going against the 2 data centers that are opening in the Vancouver region. And one of the students basically said, we need to resist AI. And unfortunately, it's a tad too late. And if you know anything about AI, you understand that by 2031, possibly 2030, that a lot of these AI programs are going to be basically training themselves, right? We're going to possibly, according to Elon Musk, have over 1 million humanoids. Now, you'll see a lot of jobs being lost to AI. I think a lot of employers are taking this quick judgment of laying off people, but essentially you're going to find a lot of these organizations are going to be rehiring for some of the same roles, because they're going to find out very quickly that you need the human counterpart in order to really govern and perform and operate with AI. Now, what is important is that every AI governance failure document in any functions is imperative, and this is what we're going to be talking about in understanding. I think from there was empirical literatures on failure, from Amazon's discontinuing hiring tools systemically discriminating against women, to New York City chatbot that provided legally incorrect guidance to small business owners throughout 2023 and early 2024. The widespread shadow, I think, of AI practice identifies the European United Artificial Office talking about the 2025 live-in respiratory, and can be traced into human behavior failures that precedes and of course enables the technical failures. So when you're looking at the module overview, what I really like you to function on is not just understanding that when we are talking about slogans or slants, remember that AI is just part of the growing fear-mongering and lack of full conversational, comprehensible understanding of what the module is actually for and what it's used for. Now, AI governance is all about a preventive measure and being proactive into mitigating or even reducing potential risk. MIT Sloan Management Review, they dried on 2025 global executive surveys of over 1,200 senior leaders, found that the gap between responsible AI intention and responsible AI practices is not primarily a technical problem. It is a cultural, leadership, and human capacity problem. This is very imperative. Cultural, leadership, and human problem. So the governance framework exists, yes, but compliance protocols are written, and the individual human beings that are operating under the guidance framework is what's pushing the operation and the deadline pressures. And of course, what we see a lot of times with individual human beings is when they're operating under deadline pressures, cognitive overload, institutional resistance, and emotional dynamics, they make decisions that really undermine every layer of governance above them, especially if you don't have a plan in place. So therefore, this is why it's so imperative that you have this plan. The model is not just about understanding AI framework. This particular module is going to provide the behavior science framework that is required to the governance that reality actually sets in. And the 6 lessons, each one grounded in peer review evidence, and it's applied to documented organizational cases. And right before you on the display, you will see that as well. I am available via email. You can find me on LinkedIn, and you can also provide messages and information just below the description point there, and I will respond to them accordingly. One of the things I do want to take your understanding is to again remember that the consistency that or implementation that lags ambition across sectors because of governance framework, it's again failed to account for human behavioral dynamics and point of execution. And the 6 lessons or 6 evidence-based instruments for government, the human variable, and AI compliance. So in lesson 4.1, it applies to Danielle Goldman and Carrie Chires's 2024 work on emotional intelligence to AI governance compliance. This is to establish AI competency not as a professional preference, but as a structural governance prerequisites. Lesson 4.2 focuses more on MAPS, Tuckerman's group development model onto AI governance team maturity, explaining why governance quality deteriorates at predictable development junctures and what intervention is required at each stage. And of course, lesson 4.3 applies to Cotter and I can never say this gentleman's name, Schlinsinger's change resistance framework. This is really grounded in 40 years of organizational evidence to discuss a specific phenomenon of AI governance, not compliance. AI governance, non-compliance. So lesson 4.4 will address workflow attachment as a neurobiology ground source of compliance failure. And we want to draw information from Solami, Beckerman, and Juliana's 2024 Systemically Reviewing the Frontier of Artificial Intelligence. And lesson 4.5 applies to Amy Edmondson Foundation research on psychological safety now, with 25 years of replication across organizational contexts. So the question of governance error disclosure, I think, and its escalation is something that we will be discussing because human behavior is at the primary risk variable. I will answer your question in 1 second. So what we find is in the changes that we're discussing, how do we escalate or how do we take measures in ensuring that these escalations don't occur on a rapid basis as we have seen them. Lesson 4.6 establishes the 4 structural mechanisms. This is transparency, insensitive alignment, procedural friction, and of course, feedback. Feedback audits are so important. So if you're getting audited or you're getting feedback, you want this. You want the clarification. You want the transparency. Now, that produces sustained behavioral accountability without relying on individual motivation. So every lesson is grounded again in scholarly peer-reviewed research. Every lesson is applied to documented organizational cases, and every lesson produces instruments that you can actually implement when you are working with these types of sources. Now, I need to inform you this video is going to be about an hour and a half. I usually teach this in between 3 to 4 hours, sometimes even 8 hours, but for the purpose of YouTube, I've cut it down to 1 hour. My goal is 1 hour and 20 minutes, but sometimes I don't meet the protocol. So here we go. So emotional intelligence in a governance text. This is focusing on the context of AI governance and emotional intelligence. So in January 2024, the city of New York City put out a chatbot called My City Chatbot and an AI-powered regulatory guidance tool deployed to assist small business owners. This was found to be providing systemically misleading advice. You can, further Google it and look into it, but it informs users that employers were legally permitted to fire workers who refused to work in unsafe conditions, which is horribly wrong. It told aspiring business owners they could operate without required licenses in several documented cases. It advised actions that would consistently violate regulatory violations. And the New York City incident became what MIT Sloan Management Review describes in its October 2025 analysis as the cautionary tale for any organization deploying AI tools at this magnitude or at this scale. When investigators finally had the time to examine the failure, they found what they consistently find in most technical AI issues, that the technical system performed as designed, right? The technical system performed as designed. The governance failure was human error. The individual responsible for reviewing the system's output before deployment did not have self-awareness to recognize the boundaries of their own competency in assessing AI outputs. The self-regulation to override deployment pressures when their assessment was incomplete, or the social skills to escalate their concerns of decision makers with sufficient authority. And if you watch module 1, 2, and 3, you would know I talk about standard forensic documentation for AI. I talk about accountability. I talk about name signature. I talk about the professional liaison, and of course the debriefing at the end, because when you are working with Lab C framework, you understand the context of it. Danielle Goleman and Carrie Charnas, they talk about writing in Leader to Leader in 2024, and they discuss the establishment that emotional intelligence is not a supplementary leadership quality, it is a predictive variable for regulatory compliance behavior. So their research really demonstrates the leadership with a high emotional intelligence that shows measurable, better compliance conduct than emotional intelligence predicts governance requires at every operational level. So EI outcomes before its procedural one. Now, I have provided the source for you at the end of this presentation, so you can go ahead and read it. Now, the 4 emotional intelligence domains are directly operated, and I believe that when we are talking about the governance framework, the policies, and the compliance protocol or ethical principles, yet we still continuously fail. And so I'm just going to walk you through these 4 just so you have a better comprehension. Self-awareness is in the context of AI again, AI governance. Self-awareness is the practitioner's capacity to really recognize the limits of their own technical and analytical competency when assessing artificial intelligence system outputs. It prevents what the research literature calls confirmation biases in risk classifications. The tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence as consistent, reliable, with an already held conclusion. So practitioners who lack self-awareness do not really flag ambiguity for independent review. What they do is they classify and identify it as an acceptable, because doing so is cognitively convenient. So the New York City case is a documented instance of the failure of that model, and that is because at an institutional scale, sorry, I'm having difficulty speaking this morning, and I think it's because I'm extremely excited. So when you go into self-regulation, self-regulation is governance contacts in the capacity to adhere to protocol requirements under deadline pressure. So resisting the temptation to circumvent documentation steps that is crucial, especially for legal liability, especially for ensuring compliance and ethical principles and policies. I keep telling you, compliance is all about documentation. So within the European Union AI Office 2025, they talked about the AI literacy practice documented that identifies as with a shadow of artificial intelligence. So the deployment and the use of AI tools outside of established governance channels, its prevalence in organization when you talk about AI competence governance teams is measurably lower. So what this means is that the evidence is direct. The self-regulation as a trained and assessed competency reduces the incidence of governance circumvention. So then you look at the empathy component, and the empathy in AI governance is not I would say relational in nicety. It's a function of prerequisite for conducting meaningful, impactful assessment or evaluation for the vulnerable population. And a practitioner or operative or an officer who cannot take the perspective of that marginalized group, a refugee, let's say, navigating an AI-powered benefit system that determines whether they qualify for, let's say, social assistance, or they qualify for mental health. The first generation university applicant processed by an AI admission tool they found that a patient whose clinical pathway is shaped by a risk stratification algorithm cannot produce an impact assessment because they reflect the actual stake of the system of deployment. So the European Union AI Act's fundamental right impactment usually goes and evaluates, assess these requirements is operationally dependent on the empathetic capacity of the individuals conducting these AI softwares and AI usage or tools for these particular cases. And what they talked about in the algorithm, and I will quote this from the UK passport algorithm, is that a facial recognition algorithm uses in the UK passport application system was found to produce significantly higher rejection rate for applications with darker skin tones. So we're talking about race and discrimination. Subsequent analysis revealed of this particular AI system that individuals who designed and validated the system performance benchmark had not conducted any assessment of differential performance across demographic groups. So failure that is simultaneously technical or empathetic. So the system could not see what humans assessing it could not perceive. It's like my dream of getting this AI system up and running that can essentially conduct, with the aid of a psychologist or psychiatrist, a full, vital, comprehensive assessment of someone who's seeking psychological treatment. Because I think psychological treatment, or physicians that think they know a lot about psychiatry, is that they don't actually know what the brain looks like. They're making presumptuous or assumptions based on past experiences, and therefore sometimes their information can be vague, their diagnosis can be guessed, or what we call educational guess. So it's hypothetical. Why is this even important? So let's talk about the social skills. The social skills is a governance context and the capacity where to communicate AI risk on a non-technical leadership and sustain that across functional relationship through the governance program are funded. So supported or enforced, the module 5 that we will be discussing later on in the next chapter in detail will find the core points that AI governance finding that cannot be communicated persuasively to a board that is narrow-minded. So we have to take the persuasive and look at it in a broad sense of perspective for practical purposes, and finding that does not exist in social skills may play a pivotal role in the social skills that is mechanism through which analytical rigor becomes institutional action. The governance application of Goldman and Chernes in 2024 research is direct. So EI competency, you have to integrate it into the selection of development of AI governance role, not as a supplementary quality, but as a structural prerequisite infrastructure. So it's not about it's a quality versus quantity. No, it's about the structure of it. And organizations that actually evaluate their technical qualifications without assessing their EI qualifications are selecting for only to the capacity that effective AI governance requires, and especially if you are using a third-party vendor to actually use their software. And remember, every organization has different requirements, and therefore when we are talking about governance implication, what we need you to understand is organizational psychology, behavior, risk management, leadership science, and institutional design that can really either work for you or work against you. So that is something I want you to think about when we are talking about matters of emotional intelligence. Now, what does that essentially mean? What are we trying to discuss? Because when you look at EI and governance, you look at the structural implication, and what does that actually discuss is not just about understanding the context itself, it's about understanding how you move with it. Now, before we move to lesson 4.2, I want you to understand the ground that EI discussion is in structural evidence, because the argument that I am making is not that the organization should hire nicer people. That's not what I'm saying. It is that we want individuals to understand empathy, and emotional intelligence and competency is a measurable asset and developed through organizational culture capacity that produces documentation that is in line with compliance, regulatory and governing bodies, and of course company goals and alignment. And outcomes, when you follow, is present, and the document compliance will not fail. Because in the absence of the latter, what you will find is failures that are going to play a pivotal role when it comes into understanding these functions or factions when you are discussing them. Now, does it generally have a particular understanding and communication capacity or rational trust or empathy? Well, again, when you look at the EU AI Office Living Respiratory Update in April, they talked about FastWeb AI Spock model that distributed the specialist governance advisor deployed across the organization's business units. What is analytically significant about FastWeb model is that the selection criteria for AI Spock's implicitly prioritizing EI competencies, but thereby looking at specifically at social skills and empathy as a functional requirement for the role. Now, FastWeb was not selecting for technical expertise alone. They were selecting for the capacity to translate governance requirement into relation terms that colleagues in adjacent functions could act on. The result, the quarterly risk assessment review that was conducted by the organization consistently across business units with governance framework published to all staff and measurable outcomes with lower incidence of shadow AI practices. What does that really mean? You can look at this research. It's called Berkman Klein Center for the Internet and Society by Harvard University in 2025. Their study talks about organizational deployment of AI governance framework that accounts for human relation dynamics. They also include stakeholders, communication capacities across functions where trust, loyalty, integrity, and transparency demonstrate substantiality a lot better than compliance outcomes than those actually relying exclusively on procedural mandate. And this is evident consistently because it shows that governance quality is a people problem before it's a process problem. So the practical governance implication is clear that emotional intelligence assessment should be incorporated into the hiring and performance evaluation of every individual working with AI governance responsibilities. The risk assessors, ethics reviews, compliance, data protection officers, and any role designed with an AI system oversight. This is not a soft recommendation. It is an evidence-based structural intervention supported by the same quality of peer review evidence that informs every other government methodology in this course. And I think when you're looking at the implication of structured governance implication, you're looking at higher criteria, you're looking at promotion, not just in retrospect of the type of people you're going to hire, but you're also looking at their strength in emotional intelligence, because again, you want to make sure that you are not just focusing on specific factors, but you're able to lead the promotional pathway with leadership assessment and evaluation. The slide itself rejects the EI is an optional or personality based. We already know that. Instead, EI is a frame as what we call measurable, trainable, operationally predictive, so therefore you can utilize it accordingly. So let's go to the next factor. Okay, I hope you guys can see the presentation. Let me just show you here. So now we are looking at Tuckerman stage that apply to AI governance. So forming, storming, norming, performance. Don't stress it because I will be putting up this presentation, the power presentation, in YouTube where you can actually go ahead and have access to it. The Tuckerman stage application in 2025, the Grant Thornton AI Impact Survey found that there is misinformation that is being had out. So the AI Impact Survey found that about 70% of Fortune 500 executives reporting having established AI risk committees, and 67% reported progress in AI infrastructure, and yet only 14% said their organization was fully ready for AI deployment. That 14% failure in the context of organizations that have already created governance structures, it is not a technical readiness problem, it is a team development problem. So when we look at Bruce Tuckerman's group development model, we talk about forming, we talk about storming, norming, and performing. Was the first published in Psychological Bulletin, I believe in 1965, and has been replicated and extended across decades of organizational research. Nadvik and Stark in 2016 studied the Journal of Nursing Education, confirmed its applicability to professional governance teams operating under regulatory pressure, specifically teams that require to make high-stake compliance judgment under conditions of role ambiguity, accountability conflict, and time constraints. These are precisely the conditions under which AI governance teams are operating right now, because you are not aware of the potential risks that may arise. You may be able to predict some, but not all. So therefore, when you are looking at understanding what each stage actually represents, you can go ahead and look into the form. Now, let me walk you through each stage with the governance behavior and the evidence-based intervention that is required in order to be designed and move forward with. Forming, when you're looking at it in AI governance team newly constituted, when roles have just been designated and designed, when the AI SPOC, the data protection officer, the ethics reviewer, the risk assessor are meeting for the first time as a governance unit. The data team is in the forming stage. So the role ambiguity is really high. Confusion about accountability, responsibility, the ownership is unclear, the interpersonal trust is very minimal between these four individuals. So the governance behavior indirectly influences the product without even realizing the outcome is what we're talking about. So what we see is that the governance behavior then produces or characterizes by differences, low initiative and dependence on directives and leadership. So the evidence-based intervention is structured role-specific onboarding, not generic AI ethics training, not organization-wide awareness campaign. These are all great to make you feel like you're part of protecting not only your employees, your organization, your reputation, your revenue, your profits, but also the people you're serving, the products you are putting out there. Therefore, when you're talking about wide awareness campaigns, you got to look at the directive role specific guidance that tells each person exactly what their governance function requires. What authority do they hold? What escalation pathway do they have or authorized to proceed with? The AI Office of 2025 Respiratory documented by Jensen and Smalls as organizations that implement structural role based on onboarding at the team formation, and both report measurable faster progression to stable governing function as a result. So people go in there and they know exactly what they're doing, right? They understand. Here's a case I want you to look up at your convenience. I'm not going to take a lot of time, but the case has to do with IBM Global Learning Platform. I'm a huge fan of IBM free services. I mean, when I started coding and learning the basics of AI a few years back, it was IBM that I did it through. And IBM's commitment to an average of 80 hours of annual learning per employee, this is documented actually in the AI Office report, because you have no idea that silently and indirectly you are teaching and furthering development of your employee, not only to keep yourself accountable, protected, legally binded, but also the person who is working alongside with you. These functions are sustained forming stage intervention. That's what it's called, forming stage intervention. So by continuously reorienting and encouraging employees to evolve in governance roles and requirements, IBM prevents the governance team stagnation that occurs when formal role designation is not accompanied by ongoing development support. And that's what you're looking for when we are talking about the forming aspect of it. Now let's move into the storming. The storming stage is where governance teams most frequently fail. and you have access to it. You can, again, I will be talking in more detail in later on lectures that I will be putting out. But again, when we're talking about the storming, it's looking at the governance team most frequently, areas that they are complacent and where they may fail, and where the consequences of the failures are most severe. So storming produces conflict over risk classification accountability, disputes between legal and ethical and product functions, and of course disagreements about the relative authority of different governance roles. In organizations with low psychological safety, which lesson 4.5 will address in detail, storming produces paralysis. And we've talked about paralysis in previous modules, so go ahead and take a look, because I don't want to take a lot of time discussing that here. And risk classifications are contested but not resolved. So accountability disputes are suppressed rather than adjudicated. So when we're talking about governance decisions are deferred, this is what we're talking about. The critical finding from the organizational psychology literature, the documentation in Riaz and colleagues' 2015 study in Human Resource Development Quarterly, is that productive storming that requires psychology and public safety to be aware of preconditions, conflicts that occur in a psychologically safe environment, and what produces governance clarity. We have seen an extreme high rate of mental health and psychological trauma and concern, whether direct or vicarious, whether burnout, in large organizations. And I will be discussing that as well in a completely separate course, and we will look at it both from the Western perspective, from East or South Asia perspective, and of course from the European perspective. Through principal disagreements, usually what we find is the conflict actually occurs because of lack of communication, lack of ability to trust, unclear organizational guidelines for the people that are involved. And you might think, well, why does that matter? Why do we even care? Well, you should care, because sometimes what we see is when we are talking about what is applied and what is not applied in specific functions, we are seeing the fast act conduct that the structural governance may not have. Now, the central thesis here is all about technical expertise, but also on team development stage. And when we are talking about the storming aspect, we're looking at the conflict, the disagreements, the authority dispute. We also look at the risk classification tensions. What is the highest risk stage rating? Remember the Amazon hiring tool case that illustrated failed storming? This has to concern existing approaches or reframing or lens, but dissent was suppressed and formal escalation had failed. So what does that all essentially mean? It means that when we are looking at specific factors, you have to understand one's action when you are dealing with this concept. So with that said, I want you to also think about what we are discussing when we are talking about the actual storming. Now, let's go talk about the norming aspect. The norming stage produces what it is called governance terms. The minimum viable compliance state that internalizes adherence to specific protocols, rules, regulation, language, and approach. And AI risk assessment procedures are followed consistently. Peer accountability also emerges through team membership, because you have team members that note and address each other's deviations from protocol without requiring manageable intervention. Because when you have that trust, what you're going to find is everybody's kind of in here trying to protect each other or look after each other. So this peer accountability is huge for any organization, because not only are they protecting the reputation, the integrity of the organization, but also the integrity of the product and they themselves. Team members then become responsible and are able to negate some of the damages that may come as a result of lack of protocol or as a result of lack of managerial intervention, right? The escalation frequency decreases because more governance questions are resolved as a team level. The FastWeb case that we talked earlier in this presentation is the clearest documented instance of norming stage governance behavior, because AI Spocks are independently applying risk assessment protocols, conducting the quarterly reviews, and managing governance compliance across business units without continuous oversight from central governance leadership. That is a norming stage performance, and it represents a substantial governance achievement for organizations that have spent years in storming. So now we're looking at not only storming, but performing. Performing stage at AI governance teams demonstrates autonomous, high-quality compliance judgment, cross-functional trust is sufficiently established that risk classifications are made at accepted without extended deliberation. And I will throw this, and I get questioned and criticized when I say this. When you have the same level of academic background, the same or similar years of experience, but different strength in different areas. Someone may be like more advanced in behavioral science. Someone may have a stronger background in computer science. You have someone who is tasked and strong in business negotiation and compliance. You put individuals together and you have built yourself, a governing company that is going to work collectively together to better each other. There's no competition because everybody seems to have the same level of background, so there is no novelty. The capability of a governed novel AI system without precedent becomes possible, but not impossible. So the governance team operates as a learning organizational tool, resources, and this continuously updates its practice and responses to the regulatory changes that are accumulated by evidence and also your system. What I like you to think about is not about what budget I'm going to spend. Think about what budget you're going to lose as a result of some of the errors if you are not cognizant and proactive and putting these measurements and framework in place. Now, what I mean by this is Esukrazdiani's generally findings from the European Union AI Office talked about the emblematic 40% of roles in the organizations evolve significantly following sustained AI governance training investment. And 18 new market services were launched as a direct consequence of the upskills programming. Now, what we're talking about is performing stage organizational behavior, where governance investment produces not only compliance quality, but competitive capacity. People might see a lot of jobs being lost at this point, and it might be as a result of specific factors. But I want you to understand that these rash decisions to lay off people is going to have consequences for the employers and the organizations. I will discuss this further, but you can also go up to, there is a young lady here by the name of L. I think it's Learning with L-AI. Or House of L-AI, and her AI channel is actually quite productive and very fact significant, and you'll be able to touch on some of these factors that they're discussing. And I genuinely believe that when you are looking at these specific factors, you're going to find the different sections of how people think and how people are impulsively drawing themselves to this information. Now, one critical finding in Tuckerman literature that governance leaders consistently underline again is teams revert. So a performing stage governance team that loses key members, observe new regulatory requirements, or experience significant organizational restructuring will revert partially or fully to an earlier development stage. This revision is not a failure. It is a predictable structural response to disruption. You have to know this if you work in HR or some cultural organization. The governance response is not to interpret revision as a failure of individual team members, but to recognize it as a restructure, redevelopment stage, and apply appropriate intervention at every stage. Now, does that mean you're going to be perfect? Does that mean you're going to have availabilities? It depended on you. Be mindful of that. Be aware of your positioning. Be aware of some of the situations that you may encounter as well. And of course, when we are talking about understanding one's critical perspective, look at the resistance change right before you, the self-interest, the misunderstanding, low tolerance, and deferring assessment. This is all evidence-based in organizational behavior. I want you to think about this question: where Tuckerman stage is your AI governance team currently operating, right? And what is the primary evidence for that assessment? Is it forming a stage difference to directly provide authority tools? Is it providing some sort of conflict? And what you're going to find is different answers, different perspectives. If you are an individual that has been in a leadership role with a vertical style management, you might find it slightly a bit more difficult in certain aspect of it, but also being able to delegate certain tools and ability. Now, one of the reasons sometimes AI representatives tend to fail is because what we see more and more is that individuals don't really necessarily understand that when you are working in certain capacities, decisions may be made. I recently got an email from a colleague, and it was written by AI, and there's nothing wrong with that. Let me tell you, I'm a huge AI fan. I think it's amazing. I speak 3 different languages in addition to English, so therefore for me, having this AI tool when I was in university, I would have been in heaven, because I paid like $5,000 and then some to have someone edit my work, only to change the context of my narrative, and I had to go back and pay somebody else, I don't know, some of amount to recorrect that error. So it is a huge tool, but we have to change the understanding and the narrative around it so people can understand how to use it. So again, I am available if you need me through LinkedIn. I will be more than happy to provide any questions or concerns you may have. Now, what you will see about the resistance to change and governance in risk behavior, this is something that you are going to find. I'm not really going to get into it because there is a study done by Coder and Schlesinger, published at their Foundation of Taxonomy of Change Resistance Source in Harvard Business Review in 1979. And they found that 45 years of organizational research has not really produced superior framework, because the 4 primary sources of resistance, again, is self-interest, misunderstanding, low tolerance for change, and different understanding or differing in assessment. So the map with direct precision onto governance resistance pattern documentation that was provided by EU, it's all about one thing: systemic review of Journal of Organizational Behavior. It's talking about understanding the multiple level review of artificial intelligence organizations, and employees fearing AI worry about their job replacement, skill erosion, and workflow disruption. But it's in contract, in my opinion, and those will argue, because if you're not familiar with AI, all predictors are non-compliance or active system circumvention. But when I was talking about this colleague of mine who sent this email, and like I said, I am open to individuals wanting to discuss, send emails, but review them, because AI is providing you the same generic information, whether it's Claude, whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's DeepSeek. Like, it's up to you which one you use. I have been a huge fan of Claude and all its different channels and comportment. And of course, if you have the time and are able to further advance yourself, yes, you don't need to code, but if you understand how to code, it's amazing. And we are finding more and more younger generation that are interested in AI. And of course, there's organizations that also are seeking a lot of individuals that work within the dark web in order to find challenges and obstacles that can prevent their systems being attacked. Now we're going to talk about the attachment to familiar work. This is talking about the psychological mechanism and the governance intervention. In 2025, a major Canadian financial institution completed a phased deployment of AI-powered credit risk assessment tool across its retail banking division. The deployment plan included a 6-week transition period during which loan officers were trained on the new system, and the legacy manual assessment process was simultaneously discontinued. So within this 8 weeks of full deployment, compliance data revealed that a significant portion of loan officers had developed workaround practices. so cutting corners. Documentation patterns that were formally satisfied the AI system's data input requirements while preserving, in practice, the structure and logic of the manual assessment process that the system was designed to replace, right? Habits are hard to change. Habits are hard to develop. And of course, when you are grandfathered into a position that you've been doing for 30, 40 years, and then someone says, hey, you got to use the software. And I don't think having that level of it's not the level of intelligence or experience, is the knowledge that is required or ascertained as a result. And 6 weeks is not sufficient, in my opinion, nor is 8 weeks. I mean, you go into any job and the first week is just understanding the compliance, but you need quite some time where you are available. Additionally, this specific institution did not provide a governance team or transition team that would be available for these individuals to call. And this cutting corners is what causes issues and problems for organizations, because what we see in a lot of these specific factors is that individuals don't realize, but when you cut corners, you're actually causing further damage than you're actually alleviating. The cognitive load dimension of the finding is particularly important for governance design, because when you establish workflow, they're not merely habits, but what we find, they are cognitive efficiency structures. So they internalize procedural knowledge that allows experienced practitioners to really perform a complex professional function with dramatically reduced working memory demand. So basically, habitual. Practice makes perfect, right? If you're doing something habitually, like, I don't know about you guys, but I park in the same spot, I get up the same time, I read the same news, I have different offices, but I like to come to the cottage area because there's less distractions, there's more availability for me to read, and of course it's better for my millions of animals that I own. No, I don't own it, millions of animals. I only own 8 rescued babies. So this is not a technology additional failure, it is a workflow that I think attachment phenomena that is happening. And the neurobiological basis is documented in Morandini and colleagues in 2023 research by Solami, Benkorn, and Geluanes, 2024 systemic review. I have that available for you at the end. Now, what we're talking about, the cognitive overload of finding these particularly important governance of design that is established for workflow, is not merely a habit, but their cognitive efficiency structure. So they internalize procedural knowledge that allows experienced practitioners or operationalists to perform tasks that professional functions, again, have been doing it based on memory. So what we are going to find is, with AI, governance replaces the procedural knowledge with a new workflow, and it is temporarily restored. The full cognitive load of deliberate effort processing is taken into initiative. The practitioners are under the time pressure. The rationale response is to minimize the load by preserving as much familiar workflow as possible. But even if you're doing that, technically you're violating the governance requirement. Again, the full governance intervention addresses the workflow. So the intervention is one. We look at the adequate transition timelines. This is where the empirical evidence, ambiguous, compressed implementation timelines to generate compliance deficit that are predictable from behavioral science alone, and then the specific threshold varieties by workflow complexities and practitioner tenure. But the minimum viable transition period of complex professional workflow is consistently longer than the timeline that business pressures typically allow. So the governance leaders must negotiate the adequate timeline with the same rigorous that they apply to their technical requirement. Intervention 2 is about parallel running periods, and this is right on your screen right here. And this allows practitioners to really operate both the established and new governance workflow simultaneously for a defined period. What we're saying is reduces the threat perception associated with a familiar workflow loss, right? The practitioners or the operationals or frontline have to retain the safety net of the known process while learning to develop competency with the new one. This is not inefficiency. It is neurobiologically grounded transitional design. And then when you look at intervention 3, this is internal championship as an attachment figure. So what we saw in a telephonic Ray championship program and Small's AI ambassador model, both documented in EU's AI Office 2025 respiratory function, partially as a psychological transitional infrastructure. So by providing a trusted, reliable, organizationally embedded peer who has already successfully made the workflow transition, these programs reduce the threat perception associated with the change that is provided with a relational bridge or gap that compliance mandates cannot provide. So intervention 4 looks at the workflow space training. This is basically generic AI governance training that contains field to reduce the cognitive load barriers, the novel governance procedures that may be new to a lot of people, including leaders, CEOs, and presidentials that are working in these organizations. Training that is specific to the practitioner's actual workflow that replicates the decision context, the information environment, and the time pressure that a real governance workflow actually produces. So what we want is not just work production, but produce substantially faster competency development and simultaneously lower the resistance as well. And you might think that, this is just a lot of jargon. It might be for some people, it might be too much when you're talking about these different gaps and different understanding, and it's okay, because again, if you look on your side, it talks about a shared belief that team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. What we find in a lot of these cases, people are reluctant to come forward and talk about if they don't know something or they're not familiar with something. And that is very normal for individuals, because what we find in a lot of these cases are individuals that want to ask questions, but they are unable to do so because they don't have the courage, or they may not have the ability to really speak up. And we talked about conformity already in module 1, 2, and 3. I don't remember if we touched it up in this module yet, but again, this is what we're looking at. Now, the psychological safety is a primary governance variable. And what does that actually mean? When we talk about trauma-informed practices and we talk about psychological safety, we look at understanding not only the culture of the workplace, but we're also trying to understand the conversations or the language that is used, that culture within a culture. Amy Edmondson defined psychological safety in her foundational paperwork. If you haven't read it, it's phenomenal. In Administrative Science Quarterly, and she discusses the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. So the definition, now 25 years in publication, has been replicated across, 100 of organizational studies, across dozens of industries, and across multiple cultural contexts. Newman and colleagues, again, another amazing author and scholar, talks about systemic review in Annual Review of Organizational Psychology. This was conducted in 2022 and synthesizes the evidence base that concludes the psychological safety is among the most robust predictors of team level performance. Error reduction, learning behavior in organizational psychology literature. And this is why when we talk about AI governance team, this is what we're discussing. So why is the governance variable? Because effective AI governance is every operational level and interpersonal risky factors. What does that mean? Because if you assess a risk, and who believes a system that has been incorrectly classified must be willing to say, wait, listen, colleagues, who may have invested months in the classification to manage, who have stock organization credibility in this decision making. And sometimes senior leadership who have already communicated the classification externally may not have the same demand of influence, hence why unions are so popular and driven in organizations, because it's that camaraderie, it's that protection, that safety net they feel. So a compliance officer who discovers an error in previously approved governance document must be willing to disclose it, meaning no silence, blue coat of wall as they call it. They have to knowingly disclose this and be like, hey, there's going to be questions about their prior competency. And this is something that I do in my as a consultant in AI governance. I will let you know up front that I have nothing personal against you. But when it comes to risk assessment, potential risk harm of the vulnerable population, organization credibility and reputability, the internal employee, staff, mental health, safety, knowing that the escalation may delay deployment, that organization has to commit publicly. You have to take that stand. So if you're a leader watching this organization, if you're a student, or if you're someone who want to pivot from where you are into governance or consulting work, you have to take those understanding that, we have this framework where we are socially conceptualized into not disrespecting or not challenging or, conforming. At this point, AI will call you out on your BS, and sometimes will provide you BS. So it's really up to how you want to proceed. And of course, the trauma-informed dimension of this lesson extends to the psychological safety analysis, because organizations bear the accountability and responsibility not for treating individual employee trauma. That is a clinical function beyond organizational mandate, but for designing governance environment that do not activate trauma, condition, threat, or response in their workforce. I think sometimes when you're looking at research, you need to think about the trauma-informed care framework. Now, there was one done by SAM HSS 2014. Again, it's a long name. I just included it in the bottom. That applies to organizational governance design by Manning in 2021, which they identified the structural conditions that minimize trauma-driven threat appraisal in a professional environment. So what we see, imagine corrections officers working in this environment, and now you're incorporating AI into their world. And already a dark environment, already an environment with toxic personalities and trauma, and you're adding these new programs or softwares into the AI system to make their jobs easier, but to some of them, they see this as a threat to their positions. So chronic stress, what we usually see make governance shortcuts individually rational. A compliance officer managing, for example, the caseload twice that professional standard recommendation. So the deadline pressure usually does not allow for deliberate processing, that accurate risk classification that is required. Well, making governance shortcuts sounds wonderful, not because they are unprofessional, because their cognitive resources are depleted. So workload calibration is a governance design requirement, not a human resource amenity. So when you're looking at research, Edmonton AC and Bransby 2020 Psychological Safety Comes of Age, Annual Review of Organizational Psychology and Organizational Behavior, and it's from page 55 to 78. And they talk about 25 years of psychological safety research converge on consistently finding organizations that rely on procedural mandate alone. The mechanism is not cultural, it's structural. Safety is created through specific organizational design and choice, not through organizational value statement and mission and outlook. And then, of course, when you look at the Canada AI model documented in EU, it provides a concrete governance design example. Their principle of impunity for errors in AI system use, or formal organizational policy that errors in AI-assisted governance processes carry no punitive consequences, is a structural psychological safety intervention. It is not a motivational statement, it is a policy with defined boundaries and definition for protection. This specifies what is going to make it effective. And of course, when you are looking at different factors, you may see things quite differently. The structural requirements, again, we're going to continue, is requirements for trauma-informed governance design for 6. I'm going to walk you through this briefly because the evidence is based for each substantial area and implication that are directly influenced. The transparent communication, of course, is consistent, clear, and predictable communication. So business communication about governance expectations and consequences that eliminates the ambiguity that is driven anxiety, that usually activates behavior avoidance. And I've heard people say they're lazy, they're complacent, they procrastinate. There's a reason for all these behaviors that are being exhibited by your staff. Individuals that continue calling in sick. I mean, if someone has had a good, amazing record of employment, minus the periodic sick days, but all of a sudden you're seeing their behavior changes. You can see the signatures when someone is going through a mental health crisis. We're not just talking about mental illness, we're also talking about mental health. Two different things. Practitioners who do not know, or CEOs who do not know, or HRMs that do not know what is expected of them in a governance role. Well, here's what constitutes adequate. Here's what constitutes compliance. Here's what we talk about avoidance behavior. Because when you are looking at reviewable concerns, what triggers an escalation will default to the minimum visible compliance that protects them from sanctions, right? And that is the goal. Transparency is about expectation. Transparency is prerequisite for genuine compliance. And if you don't have transparency, well, that's a different topic. Now, procedural fairness. Cotter and Schicksner in 1979, research established perceived unfairness in compliance enforcement as a primary predictor of effective resistance. Did you hear that? Primary predictor. So when senior management or administration observes the governance requirements are applied inconsistently, that sometimes teams receive enforcement attention, others do not, some show favor, some do not, that some individual is accountability, consequences, and others do not. So what you need to interpret is the inconsistency signatures and evidences that are, failing to compliance in a political rather than principle. That interpretation produces strategic compliance behavior rather than a genuine compliance behavior. So here's a difference when we're talking about emotional intelligence and empathy. We're not talking about sympathy. You have to understand, here in Canada, specifically in Ontario, we talk about political acuity, being able to deliverance, or train other people. That is very significant when we are talking to individuals about that. And of course, when you are talking about specific factors, the ideology behind it is to understand those factors. And when we talk about fairness, what we want to understand is you have to understand that you need to take an approach for non-punitive escalation, right? You might think, well, why would I do that? Why would I care? Error disclosed mechanisms that carry no sanctions are the structural foundation of a psychologically safe governance environment. When you look at the Anaconda AI model, is a clearest documented implementation. What is important analytically is that non-punitive escalation must be a formal policy with a defined scope. I talked about scope in the last module. Not an informal cultural norm, not generation practice that has been passed down from one work group to the next. Cultural norms are fragile. They erode under leadership change, organizational pressure, individual incident management decisions. Formal policy is structural. Then we have to look at the workload calibration. Chronic cognitive overload makes governance shortcuts individually rational. I can tell you this working in corrections for 17 years. It was something that I was doing. And during this whole process, I had no idea that I was actually going down very fast, very quick. And I thought I was doing okay. However, what you don't understand is compliance programs that add governance requirements to already saturated practitioner workload or employee workload without corresponding workload reduction. This creates the condition of what we call a systemic governance failure. This is not a welfare concern. It is a governance design requirement that is grounded in cognitive science evidence. And if you don't know what that is, you need to attend one of my psychology introduction courses, Peer support structures, again, ACEBOC and AI ambassador models documented in the EU report, functions partly as a psychological containment structure. This distributed point of relational support that reduces the threat to perception associated with governance uncertainty, and the evidence is from psychological safety in literature. Yeah, I have no issues responding to your question. I was just hoping that you wait until I finish the presentation, and I would be honored to send you all the paperwork. You have no issues there. Absolutely. Absolutely. I do provide free live online sessions. If you're interested, you can let me know. So, and then here we're going to jump from workload calibration to peer support structures. Again, peer supports are so important. It's not about hierarchy issue. It's about psychological, like I said, containment. We were just talking about it. Sorry, I got sidetracked. No problem. I'm not upset. I'm just saying. And one of the things I want to talk about that is so important, even for me, at this level of academics and work experience, I think the evidence formed from psychological safety literature that I like to always put out there is peer support. Peer support reduces individual threat perception a lot more than a hierarchical reassurance, because the peer is perceived as a sharing the same vulnerability. They may face the same threats. Therefore, when you have a peer support, especially in an AI governance model, it's easier for an employee to go to a peer support and say, hey, I'm having issues, here are the issues. And then that person can come and speak to someone like me, or maybe a member of my team, and then we can actually elaborate and figure this out. And then we approach it in a manner where we want the person to understand this is educational training. This is not punitive. We don't think that person doesn't meet the IQ threshold. Listen, I studied psychology and criminology. My PhDs represent that. But in reality, I found AI 5 years ago, and my neurodivergent brain started to look at neuroscience and understand neurons in relation to AI and its advancement to understanding the mind, the brain, and the lack of whatever your interest is. Now, that is something I wanted you to focus on. Now let's go to the leadership modeling, which is one of the most important factors. Leadership modeling is about leaders who demonstrate emotional intelligence, acknowledge uncertainty in their own governance judgment. And the model principle inquiry is more about rather than projecting false certainty, you want to establish a psychological condition required for genuine governance compliance throughout the organization. And I have made this error so many times, because sometimes I think I overindulge my staff and then it backfires. And I'm the first to tell you. And of course, then what you see is embezzlement, you see distrust, you see reports that are inaccurate. And when you are working for a client, especially when I'm working for someone, every employee that submits a report, I don't sign off, I actually read it. And then I would provide my feedback in a separate document that I hold, and I will send it to the team. That way everybody is in the know, it's time spent according, it's dated. That is my seal of protection and digital practice. Now, what does that do? It establishes psychological condition required for genuine governance compliance through the organization, or through my team in this case. This is Goldman and Chersnow's 2024 finding that apply to leadership level. The most effective AI governance leadership are not those that project the most authority, but those that have a model that is most accurate with self-assessment and self-evaluation. Meaning that if I make a mistake, or my staff make a mistake, I'm not going to say, well, it was John Doe that did it, I'm just the boss. No, I take full responsibility for my staff and their actions and their decisions, because as someone who's been in the field, especially if my staff is very novice or they're new to the industry, what I want to do is build the confidence and the credibility and the validity, but also build that accountability when you're looking into governance. The objective of this lesson is precise. It is not to produce behavioral uniformity that we see in a lot of organizations like paramilitary. We see it in the police force. We see it in the hospitals. We see it in teachers' worlds. Everywhere. You see it everywhere. But the identical compliance behavior across all levels of employees is as imperative. So the objective is both unachievable and undesirable at times, but it would also eliminate the principle of professional judgment that is effective governance requires. The objective is to design a structure or structural condition that usually makes compliant choice easier, or I should say choices easier, and more visible and more consequential than non-compliant alternatives. And when you provide that contingency plan, when you provide alternatives, you're giving those individuals an alternative to challenge their old critical and analytical theories into understanding whether they're on the right track. You're also allowing those individuals to realize asking for further direction or clarification or explicitity is important, or maybe they want to explore the topic more. That is fundamentally very different in governance design problem, and it has a different solution in its architectural design. In early 2026, Grant Thornton's AI Impact Survey reported that 78% of senior business leaders, again, lack full confidence that their organization could pass an independent AI governance audit within 90 days. Why? The figure across organizations that have governed frameworks in place, it's a direct evidence of the gap between governance policy and governance practice and governance requirement. The gap is not knowledge problem, it is a structural problem. The government looks at the governance environment that has not been designed to make, compliant choices the path of least resistance to human implementing it, one. And two, how does this affect vulnerable humans or human decision making, human final outcome, especially when you're dealing with factors involving social assistance, factors involving individuals that don't speak English, or maybe coming from rural or smaller communities that may not be financially providing the supported needs that they require, right? And you might think, well, no, everybody has common sense. Yes, everybody has some form of common sense to the ability and the capacity of their knowledge. I'm not calling anybody any names. What I'm saying is that we learn based on our own experience. When someone says, I don't want to go to school because I learned the same thing, okay, I agree. But what you will also learn in addition to that is the ability to learn to stand up for yourself, learn to conform. After all of these factors, what you will find is your ability to decipher and make decisions for yourself. When you see the newer generation saying, hey, me, myself, and I am all for it. You know why? Because for so long we've been embedded as the older population saying, well, no, I can't say no because I need to take this task on. But if you take this task on and you don't know what you're doing, you're actually causing more reputable and direct harm to the organization. But again, the responsibility is passed down from one person to the next. But when you're talking about AI governance, the accountability, the signature name, the date and time is responsible for that person. So there's no passing the buck. For structural mechanism, transparency mechanism, AI intervents, audit trials, training completion records, stage-gated approvals make governance behaviors visible to leadership, to peers, to regulatories, to practitioners themselves. So visibility is insufficient as a compliance mechanism alone, but it is absent enables systemic circumvention at a higher scale, right? So when you're talking about governance behavior is invisible, the rationale individual calculus is to minimize effort. When a governance behavior is visible, the calculus changes. The fast web model, this is where time, straws, risk assessment reviews published to all staff internet, is a visible architecture that is not only accountable, reliable, and of course it's an opportunity for them to continue to report to it. But what we also see, it is the effect that it's not primarily punitive, it is social and it's reputational. So administrators who know their governance conduct is visible to colleagues produce different governance behavior than practitioners who believe it is not, right? So what we found in Harvard Law School Forum on a corporate governance study in 2025, that 72% of S&P 500 companies disclose at least one material AI risk in 2025. 72%, up from 12% in 2023. The increase in disclosure is attainable partially of regulatory pressures and partially to the emergence of the governance audit expectations from institutional investors, from stakeholders. When visibility is externally demanded, organizational compliance actually improves. That's why I say when you get audited, it's actually a good thing. You know, you might think, oh my God, yes, oh my God is right. But you're legally being protected without you even knowing. Yes, if you don't, you know, spend the budget, spend the time, and get the team that you need, this is what you're dealing with, right? Because what you're doing is then people like myself will take on the accountability and the responsibility, people like myself and my team, right? So this is how we see when you are visible, the mechanism should be designed to replicate the compliance pressure of an external audit. So you are designing an audit for your organization that when an auditor says, hey, I'm auditing you, you're like, here you go. Here's all the, you know, compliance. Here's all the complaints. Here's what we documented. Here's the gaps that we have identified. What did you do? How were they rated? What approach did you take? Who was informed? Were, you know, anybody harmed in the process? The feedback structural and the procedural friction are all coming into place. So procedural friction is design decision pathway. This allows you to make non-compliant choices structurally inconvenient. And of course, when you look at the Workday model governance checkbook that embedded at every protocol lifecycle stage, it's provided in module 1, 2, and 3. What you will find is mandatory legal reviews above a defined risk threshold. And I say this, even if you hire an organization like mine to conduct these assessments, I strongly recommend for you to hire someone outside of my network in order to assess our work. They are required to invest additional efforts in order to protect you, not only for accountability and legal protection, but also in order to protect yourself if necessary. The investment changes that cost benefit calculations at an individual decision level, it's very different, and producing compliance outcomes without really requiring surveillance. Again, I still will tell you upfront that I think you should be conducting 24/7 monitoring of the system of the AI. Even if you think, well, I'm not paying this person much, you may want to hire a couple of part-timers, but remember, when you have someone available to your staff to respond accordingly, in writing or whether it's by phone, you have less of a problem. And sending someone a link, oh, go and review, no, that's not how it works. You need to find someone who's going to sit down and explain this to your employees, even if it means, you know, the person has to take time. This is something you can negotiate in your contract. You know, if you're working for our organization, there's going to be time that is required that you may stay after a certain period where you need to train our staff that works night. You may have to train our executives that are working on a weekend. It's their only availability. That AI governance team that you're bringing in has to be flexible. Most of our work is conducted on site, but we have individuals that conduct research in the comfort of their own home. Now, the feedback structure, the most consistently underinvested governance mechanism in any empirical literature that I have touched on, and the feedback always loops back between governance action, governance outcome. So administrators who complete risk assessment without ever learning whether their assessments were accurate cannot calibrate their judgment quality. Let me repeat that. Administrators who think by completing a risk assessment that they would avoid any accountability or responsibility without ever learning whether their assessment is accurate do not understand the severity of their judgment and the quality of it. They cannot identify patterns in their own errors. They cannot improve it. They cannot protect the organization. They cannot protect the stakeholders, the investors, the clients, the product. So the IBM Continuous Learning Platform Responsive Adaptation Regulatory Requirement is evolving governance standards. It is a document feedback architecture. It is effective on government quality, improving it over time, and substantially larger than the effect of any single training intervention. And if you want to learn more about that, feel free to go into IBM Learn, and most of their courses are free, but you may have to pay a fee for the exam to obtain the certification. That is something that I would suggest when you are working within the AI, or if you think your company is going to be using AI. And another thing I will tell you is, if your company does not have Claude, ChatGPT, or any other form of AI that can help you write like Grammarly, do not upload that into your workforce. You would actually be harming the system more than you would ever imagine. So if you want to do something, like if you want to, have the ability to write, you can bring your own computer and write it accordingly and then transfer. But remember, anything you give to AI, it's AI, information. It's the same thing when I, hear students say, Snapchat is safe. Snapchat. Listen, you put something in the world of AI, it is now part of the world of AI. Deleting it is surface cleaning, right? Have you heard of surface cleaning? When people clean just the surface, not underneath? Yes, I'm one of those people. I like the cosmetic look, but when I have to get ground and dirty, I usually like to bring someone in to clean, right? So it doesn't cover, and that is something you need to be accountable for. The human variable of AI governance, and don't worry, this is the last slide, is the 6 lessons of the module coverage on a single analytical conclusion, that we are going to discuss the empirical literature that has established with these 6 consistently, and increased it from 2020 till specific day. Now, human dimensions of AI governance is not peripheral to compliance outcome. They are detrimental to them. The evidence is consistent across every lesson that I have been teaching, and Coleman and Chrisman demonstrate that EI competency predicts compliance. And no, I am talking about emotional intelligence. EI is not Indians, they're South Asians. I just want to correct that. When we're talking about quality more reliably than procedural mandate, Tuckerman's development model explains why governance quality deteriorates as to the predictable junctures regardless of the framework sophistication. Coder and Schelsno established that the resistance is structurally predictable and requires structural intervention. And Solami and Beckernam and I can never say his name, Galulina, show that workflow attachment is neurological phenomena and not an attitudinal one. Edmondson, 25 years of psychological safety research demonstrated that a genius compliance requires a structural condition for interpersonal risk taking and interpretation. And I'm also going to add perception and years of experience and possible on-the-job trauma. So the accountability by design evidence establishes that structural mechanism outperform motivational intervention, but additionally in producing sustainable government behavior, so accountable behavior. Yes, people are still going to cut corners. It's part of human nature, but at least you can say 80% are following a governance behavior. The organization that will allow AI successfully in the regulatory environment by 2026 and beyond are not the ones with the most sophisticated framework. They are the ones whose human governance capacity matches the ambition of their governance architecture. This is a standard, and this is module concept that I'm trying to build. Humans work side by side with AI. Now, in one of my previous sessions, someone said, well, I work at such and such company and robots are picking up boxes. Yeah, but when a robot gets tired and falls, who picks it up, right? You're always going to have the ability to advance yourself. And most companies, even though we talked about Amazon here today, I mean, I don't know much about Amazon, but one thing I do know from reading some of the scholarly papers that had incorporated them, they do provide a lot of training, but I don't know the exact percentage, but hypothetically, let's say probably less than 10% of people actually will take those trainings. Just by looking at my reviews on these courses, the individuals that are taking these courses by far are individuals that are in the field. Right? They're probably the same age category as myself, and they are wanting to better themselves academically and be able to find jobs. Unemployment right now is slightly a bit higher, but don't lose hope, because we are going through this transition. And as a result of this transition, there are a lot of decisions being made by not only employees and employers, stakeholders, that is that is in error, and we're going to see the aftermath soon. Now, this is something I wanted to talk to you guys about, and before we go, this course is free. Every module, every framework, every instrument, the commitment is not charging, but the research, the script development, and the production that goes into the content of quality that is made to sustain the investment, time, and effort. If this module gave you something you will use, a framework, a case analysis, a structural intervention you're going to implement, and you would like to support the work that makes it possible, I have a Ko-fi page, and the link is in the description below. I love listening and reading your comments. I love reading emails as well. You can follow me on LinkedIn. That is provided in the description below. And again, thank you for being here. I have also incorporated the references that I used for this presentation. Feel free to go ahead and use it. And like I said, if you want to utilize this power presentation, feel free, as long as you give credit where it's due, meaning that you just keep my name and information. Even if you decide to take some information out of here, I would still appreciate if you just give our organization a chance. Anyways, thank you so much, and I will see you for the next module.